Grab a seat in the Nosebleeds section and listen up. Episode 3 of From the Nosebleeds MMA podcast is in your ear. Whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or SoundCloud, I'm Blake O'Rulian alongside Brick Harris, here to provide a weekly update for all things MMA. Whether it's cage side or from the cheap seats, we got you. Special thanks to Robert Jemias and Don't Be a Richard Music for helping us make this show what it is. Brick, are you ready to throw down?
I'd say I'm about as ready as Daniel Cormier was. So, I mean, pretty ready, but you never know.
But you never know when that gas tank is going to...
Ready, but let's just put it that way. All right, today on FTN, we have got a loaded show. Not quite as loaded as UFC 241 was, but in the spirit of that incredible UFC event, we are so excited, and I hope we got our gas tanks ready because we have got a long 5 rounds, but we are both so excited. Round 1, we're going to be hitting DC and Stipe analysis. We're going to be breaking down that amazing heavyweight bout. Round 2, we're going to be talking about what is next for both fighters, both Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic. Round 3, we are going to be talking about Nate Diaz and Anthony Pettis, the return of the anti-hero. Round 4, we're going to be taking a little bit of a break from 241, and we're going to be talking about the unsung heroes, the people that maybe didn't necessarily either get their hand raised or maybe didn't get a fight of the night bonus. And then round 5, we are going to be talking about possibly fight of the year, Yoel Romero versus Paulo Costa. Now, usually we would go turning it back Tuesday, but instead, with no fights this week and everything that just went down this past Saturday, Blake and I decided that we're not going to turn it back, but rather look forward. We're going to talk about Daniel Cormier losing on Saturday and the fact that it's safe to say that the number 1 pound-for-pound spot is up for grabs.
So currently, the pound-for-pound rankings are Jessica Andrade as number 15, 14, Tyron Woodley, 13, Conor McGregor, 12, Valentina Shevchenko, 11, Stipe Miocic, 10, Tony Ferguson, 9, Robert Whittaker, 8, Kamaru Usman, 7, Dustin Poirier, 6, Amanda Nunes, 5, Max Holloway, 4, Henry Cejudo, 3, Khabib Nurmagomedov, 2, John Jones, and number 1, Daniel Cormier. So when I found out we were going to do this for the show, Brick, I decided to take it side by side, add a couple people, drop a couple people, switch up, what the lineup is, what the pound-for-pound rankings are, to my opinion, and what I think it should be following this fight. And I want to begin with something that I kind of took priority, and that is activeness this year and level of competition that they've faced. So just a little precursor there. So my picks for the pound-for-pound ranking are number 15, same as the UFC's, Jessica Andrade. Number 14, Israel Adesanya. 13, Daniel Cormier. Drops down to 13. And that's only because of how many great fighters there are right now and how many crazy hot streaks there are. So I'll continue. Number 12, Tony Ferguson. And I wanted Tony Ferguson to be so much higher, but with only one fight and defeating Cowboy Cerrone the way he has, he has time to develop and things like that. 11, Robert Whittaker. Number 10, Dustin Poirier. And I'll tell you why. Number 9, I want to add somebody, and I think he'll be in that next update of the pound-for-pound rankings, Colby Covington. What he did to Robbie Lawler 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, I guess I should say, a week and a half ago, was absolutely breathtaking, stunning, and he absolutely deserves a spot in the top 10. Number 8, Stipe Miocic, new heavyweight champion of the world. Number 7, Valentina Shevchenko, after beating Liz Carmouche. She has been on an absolute tear. And I'm sorry, the Colby-Robbie Lawler fight was 2 weeks ago. It was Valentina Shevchenko that was a week ago. My apologies. Number 6, welterweight champion of the world, Kamaru Usman, and how he was able to just absolutely dismantle Tyron Woodley. Number 5, Max Holloway. Despite the loss to Dustin Poirier, he is still the king of the featherweight division and cannot be stopped. Number 4, simply because we have not seen him in almost a year, Khabib Nurmagomedov. Number 3, Amanda Nunes. Absolutely incredible year. Number 2, my guy, Triple C, the king of cringe, Henry Cejudo. And number 1, and I think we agree on this, Brick, John Bones Jones.
The only input I'm going to have about this top 15 list is the number 1. Because honestly, I do agree with you on every single one. And the fact that you put John Jones at number 1, to me, is a no-brainer. In my opinion, John Jones has been the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world since he took over the belt in 2011. A little bit about John Jones as a number 1 pound-for-pound. John Jones, just for your information, has headlined 17 of his last 18 fights. He has been the main event of every single fight since the Ultimate Fighter finale in, I think, 2010. It was when he has his only loss on paper, which was a bogus disqualification. John Jones has been the most absolutely dominant fighter in MMA history over the past decade, and he will continue to be. I agree. Honestly, my take should not shock anyone. It's been John Jones. He is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. I think there are so many things to happen in the future with John Jones and with the rest of that list that I think we are going to shuffle those names 3 times in the next 12 months.
When I was making this list, it was so difficult because there's so many great names. Tony Ferguson, the number 12 pound-for-pound fighter, simply because he just hasn't been fighting enough. Like, that's absolutely insane. And then I have to put Khabib at 4 because he hasn't been fighting. But then you have Henry Cejudo, who's had the most insane 2019 of any fighter, who has to be number 2 because of just how dominant John Jones is. And I'm really surprised that you didn't get mad about the Dustin position or the Stipe position or anything like that. But thanks for giving me a break for today.
Honestly, I give you the nod on every single one of those because again, so much is going to change in the next year. You have Dustin Poirier and Khabib facing off in 2 weeks. You have John Jones, who has major implications in the MMA world today with Brock Lesnar, with a possible Stipe Miocic fight.
That would be crazy. That would be
so
crazy.
much craziness is going to happen in literally every single division of the UFC in the coming year.
This might be bias. This might be recency bias, but I think there's no better time to be an MMA fan. This is just like what they've done this summer with all these stacked, main events and co-main events is they are building up these superstars and making room for the new generation, but they're really just doing a great job, and I'm just having so much fun being an MMA fan these days.
Personally, I think it was the head kick heard around the world of Valentina Bolashevchenko versus Jessica Ai. It was either that or the 5-second wonder George Masvidal and Ben Askren. Since then, every fight card has been stacked, and we have not been disappointed a single weekend by the UFC.
I was almost petty and put Ben Askren at 15, but I just can't do it.
I appreciate you not doing that, honestly.
All right, let's jump into round 1. We are going to be talking about Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic's fight this past Saturday. So I personally picked Stipe to win this fight for a few reasons, one of them just being the size, 2 being the fact that I thought that he was winning that first fight and Cormier simply caught him. 3, I think that age sometimes catches us more than we think. Cormier has aged better than 99.9% of all of us, except for Yoel Romero. I don't know how he's still doing what he's doing. We'll talk about that later. But he was dismantled, and part of that could have been due to the fact that he's 40 years old. What do you think about that, Brig?
I think I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but I'm sticking with my opinion that I gave about a week ago that I think Daniel Cormier was going to win this fight. I still stand behind that. And I know that Daniel Cormier lost, but hear me out. Chael Sonnen said years ago against Anderson Silva, he beat Anderson Silva to death. And in the final round, Anderson Silva got him in a triangle choke and forced him to tap out. It was a submission win for Anderson Silva. Chael Sonnen said later on, in some alternate fighting universe, you can beat a man up for 20 minutes straight. He wraps his legs around your throat, and then somehow they call him the winner. I don't disagree that stoppage was totally justified. DC was KO'd by Stipe. But listen, hear me out. Daniel Cormier won that fight. If that fight had gone to the decision, Daniel Cormier by unanimous decision and still.
Stipe was this is the only reason I dispute that, is Stipe was chopping up Daniel Cormier, and he did very well in the second round. And a lot of people thought that if round 4 would have ended, it would have been 2-2 going into the championship rounds, and it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened, especially due to the body shots that Daniel Cormier had taken. That's the only reason that I would dispute that. However, it's interesting to think about. Daniel Cormier looked good. He did not look like a scrub by any means. Yes, he got beaten down, and that's a great point by talking about Anderson Silva and Chael Sonnen and how that fight went down, because you're totally correct. However, I do think that there has something to be said about Stipe's way to analyze the fight during the fight and realize, hey, if I can get him enough in the body, he's going to start covering that. And then my strong, powerful, stone hands can give him an overhand right, and he'll be done. And so I applaud Stipe for his fighter IQ and his ability to adjust, because he was not winning that fight in general. He wasn't. And obviously the environment and the climate changed, and he ended up winning. But Daniel Cormier was dominating that fight on the ground and all these different things. A couple things I did not mention last week that I wanted to mention this week. Daniel Cormier was a little in his own head this past week. Let's go back to UFC 214. Daniel Cormier, John Jones 2. Cormier is ready to fight. Cormier wants a rematch at 205, and he wants to beat the greatest ever. Where was UFC 214? Anaheim, California. He loses that fight, cries in the post-fight interview with Joe Rogan. Where was UFC 214? Anaheim, California. A few weeks ago, he mentioned on Ariel Helwani's show that he was tentative to take the fight, or his wife was tentative for him to take the fight because of what had happened in Anaheim in the past. He was in his own head, the paranoia. I saw something on Embedded, and that caught my eye as well. I can't stop thinking about this. Cormier shakes Stipe's hand in the hotel. He walks away. Totally respectful, nothing crazy. Cormier walks back to the hotel room where all of his buddies are playing video games, all of his team and all of his people. And he goes, guys, I just shook Stipe's hand. I just saw him in the hallway. And his hand is harder. He's stronger. He feels more solid than he did the last time we fought. The better guy does not always win, but the better mind a lot of the time can. DC looked great. 8-inch reach advantage. Stipe had an 8-inch reach advantage on him, and Daniel Cormier was still able to pop and move and do all those things. But it just wasn't enough, and I think part of that had to do with his mental state when he was going into that fight. He might have walked in a little bit defeated before the first bell rang.
I think this fight was won and lost, absolutely like you just said, on an aspect of mentality. Daniel Cormier looked better than Stipe. He looked better than Daniel Cormier had ever looked before. He was outstriking Stipe on significant strikes, although Stipe destroyed him on body shots and strikes that would eventually lead to his fourth-round KO. But Daniel Cormier out-wrestled him. Daniel Cormier dominated him with wrestling. In my opinion, he dominated him with significant strikes. He dropped Stipe much more than he was dropped himself. And let's talk a little bit now that fight is over. Let's talk a little bit now about what is going to happen. We have talked so much and we have heard so much in the past few days from Daniel Cormier about the possibility of retirement. He put out a very long post on Instagram just the other day saying, I am unbelievably, disappointed in myself. I'm sorry I've let so many people down. And then he goes on in the post to just thank Dana White, thank the UFC, thank his family, thank his friends. It sounded like an obituary. It sounded like final words. Do you know what I mean?
So he said that he is going to, and we're in round 2, by the way. What's next for these two fighters? I saw the Instagram post, and it was very emotional, beautiful, really. And I think Cormier knows it. Brett Okamoto thought so as well, and his Instagram post seemed to show that it might be time for him to hang up the shoes. Daniel Cormier has beaten the best of the best, and he has lost to some of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport. With 22, 2, and 1, he's beaten everyone he needs to, from Bigfoot. He beat Gustafsson, Anthony Johnson twice, Dan Henderson, Frank Mir. His resume is undeniable. He has no reason to hang his head low. Stipe is a great fighter, and he has so many other sources of income. Stipe is a great fighter, but Daniel Cormier has so many sources of income and that he's working on. I think it would be smarter for him to simply walk away as the legend that he will be remembered as.
This will prove to be the end of the Daniel Cormier legacy. You said it last week, and I applaud you again for an incredibly accurate hot take. However, like I said last week, massive decisions need to be made because now Daniel Cormier does have something to lose. He's looking at a record, what you just said, 2 losses, 1 no contest. In my eyes, Daniel Cormier is sitting on 3 losses. Anyone who's seen all of his fights knows Daniel Cormier has lost 3 times in his career. Right. However, all roads lead to Jon Jones. And I'm going to be talking about Jon Jones in almost every single segment of the day because of how pivotal Jon Jones is in the UFC today. Jon Jones is the end of the road for Daniel Cormier if he decides to stick around. Who's Daniel Cormier going to fight to revive his legacy? Curtis Blades?
There's no one.
There's no one but Jon Jones. No one. And in my opinion, it's the same for the Stipe Miocic. Stipe has already beaten the best names in the heavyweight division. All roads lead to Jon Jones. So Stipe Miocic now has a huge decision to make. Does he advertise the fact that he wants Jon Jones, or does he continue winning comfortable fights against Derek Lewis and old Junior Dos Santos and old Alistair Overeem has 17 losses. I figured that out the other day.
But like 30 million fights, so,
True.
He's got what you can get.
Right. He's been around forever. But what I'm trying to say is Stipe Miocic has nowhere to go but Jon Jones. If Stipe wants to solidify himself as the greatest heavyweight of all time, he's got to beat someone else. And this is not to take away from his win against DC because that in and of itself is historic. But he has to go to Jon. There's no other way.
Stipe Miocic, following that fight, defeating Daniel Cormier, the pound-for-pound number 1, regaining his title after his loss a year ago, he is the greatest heavyweight of all time. As for Stipe, the marathon continues. And for Stipe, the heavyweight title is a little light, the heavyweight division, is a little light at the moment. He has beaten basically everyone, like you just said. I will say that the pound-for-pound number 1 fighter is Jon Jones. Jon Jones has been the king of 205 for almost a decade. He has cleaned out the division twice. He is the greatest 205er of all time. It's time for a new challenge. It's time to see what these heavier guys are made of. Are you still the greatest striker with impeccable technique? Are you still able to use your speed and movement the same way? I want to see Stipe Miocic versus Jon Jones at heavyweight. The knock on Jones, outside of all of his controversy and things that he's done and mistakes he's made, is the fact that he's always been safe at 205. I'd like to see him in some uncharted territory. In the meantime, there are some great young talents at 205 that should build up their pedigree a little bit so that they have the opportunity to fight Jon Jones. Dominic Reyes and Johnny Walker. I think that's a great fight to close out 2019, close out the 205 division for a little bit, and let's wait and see who wins that fight, who gets to fight Jon Jones. But in the meantime, Jon Jones has fought 3 times this year, and he wants one more. He wants to stay active. He says he wants one more. Let's do Stipe Jon Jones at heavyweight. Stay active, and if Jon Jones can beat Stipe Miocic at heavyweight, there's no question. There's no question as to who's the greatest of all time. The only knock he's had is, he's always stayed in his division and he's always been playing it safe. Jon Jones goes up to heavyweight, fights Stipe Miocic. That would be one of the biggest fights in UFC heavyweight history. Round 3, here we come. It was the return of the anti-hero of the UFC, Brig. Nate Diaz versus Anthony Pettis. In my opinion, that is maybe the best performance in the history of Nate Diaz's career. The fact that he came back, and I was so wrong on this, the ring rust factor that was completely not there. He looked better than he ever has. His wrestling ability, his dirty boxing, his Muay Thai clinching. And Pettis fought a good fight, but Nate Diaz was just miles ahead of him in everything, the way that he applied pressure. Let's not forget this. Anthony Pettis is a black belt under Daniel Vanderlei. Nate Diaz is a second-degree black belt under Cesar Gracie, and you saw the difference in their jiu-jitsu and their grappling exchanges. Anthony Pettis could not do anything off of his back, and Nate Diaz was able to just get on top, do whatever he wanted to him, moved him out over and over again. Nate Diaz was just on another planet.
We said in last week's show, previewing the Anthony Pettis-Nate Diaz fight, that cardio and stamina would make the all-around difference in this fight, would determine the winner. And although we were correct, there was an element that we kind of overlooked. Emotion and hype is what got Anthony Pettis tired too early. Nate Diaz doesn't deal with hype. We thought the lights and all that stuff would throw him off. Nate Diaz did the most Nate Diaz thing you can possibly do. We thought the cameras, we thought the open workouts, we thought the face-offs, the interviews were going to throw Nate Diaz off. Nate Diaz threw off the media, not vice versa. Nate Diaz, what did he do? Showed up to open workouts. He didn't break a sweat. He was rolling joints. He was literally smoking in his open workout. Nate Diaz completely giving the double birds to anyone and everyone who had eyes on him. And then you think, okay, well, he still has face-offs. He still has other interviews to do. What does he do? He doesn't show up to face-offs. Anthony Pettis faced off with Dana White. And when I first saw that video, I was so confused. I was like, did Diaz drop out? And if he did, then they wouldn't be even doing a face-off. No, he just didn't show up. Nate Diaz pulled off the most Nate Diaz thing that you possibly could have done. And his dirty boxing was so sound. His jiu-jitsu, he landed massive knees on Anthony Pettis, which tired Pettis out. But again, we thought that the media and all this stuff was going to tire Diaz out, and he just took it away from it. He made it a fight about fighting. He didn't make it a fight about UFC 241. He made it a fight about Nate Diaz's comeback.
It was beautiful. I absolutely loved every second of it. And I actually saw a question earlier on social media, and it said, who had the best performance of UFC 241? And I'm like, it's not even a question. Nate Diaz's comeback was one of the most crazy things in terms of how sharp he was and all of those different things. And then how he ended the fight in his post-fight interview with Joe Rogan. First thing he says, it's Nick Diaz's army. And the crowd went crazy. And then he moves on to say, I want to fight Jorge Masvidal. And the world turned upside down. Everyone went bananas. Jorge Masvidal looks like he just got the coolest toy on Christmas morning. He was so excited for this. If Nate gets the jump on Jorge Masvidal, he is in contention for a UFC title bout against the winner of Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman. That is the most interesting story in the welterweight division currently.
Let me hit you with something.
Okay.
Nate Diaz is the drunk uncle of the UFC. Absolutely. Nate Diaz takes a 3-year hiatus. He shows up to only the biggest events, Christmas, Thanksgiving, big family parties, and then he's gone. You only hear from him when he's slurring his words or he's getting in street fights. And then he comes back and he makes one of the greatest UFC returns that we have ever seen, calling out one of the biggest names in the welterweight division in Jorge Masvidal. I know this isn't a talking point necessarily on our show of what's after this fight, but here's my take. Anthony Pettis will remain a relevant fighter. Nate Diaz has the opportunity to regain welterweight gold by fighting Jorge Masvidal and then, as you said, getting a title shot.
A quick shout out to Nate Diaz for just being Nate Diaz. Did you see the press conference after, like when the fights are over and they're in the back? They said, what do you think about Colby Covington? He said, who's Colby Covington? He didn't know who he was, Brick. He said, what weight class is he in? He said, welterweight. He's like, oh, okay. Is he cool? Nate Diaz made this event so special, and I think he also made this round so fun for us to talk about.
Round 4. We are going to be talking about unsung heroes of UFC 241. As 241 came to a close, there were so many questions and there were so many answers with the big names. Stipe, DC, Paulo Costa, Yoel Romero, Nate Diaz especially. But what about the guys who didn't make that big of a stomp necessarily in the media or in the interviews or in the bright lights of what was UFC 241?
So I have 2 unsung heroes of UFC 241, guys whose performances simply just aren't being talked about enough. Number 1, and I mentioned this on our Instagram story, Drakkar Klose. Drakkar Klose was on the undercard on ESPN and put on an incredible performance. He was an underdog coming into the fight against Christian Yagos and put on one heck of a performance and one of the fights of the year for me, Brick. At one point, Klose picked up Yagos and slammed him back onto the ground, WWE style. Yagos, when they started to scramble on the ground, Yagos was able to almost catch Klose in an arm guard, or in an arm bar. I'm sorry. They got out of it, but it was really just crazy. Klose finished the fight and called out Gregor Gillespie at the end of the fight. Gillespie is an absolute cardio machine. For those of you who don't know who Gregor Gillespie is, he is in the 155-pound division. He is an absolute animal. His submission game is incredible. His grappling game is incredible. Next to Khabib, he is the best grappler in the division. And Klose just goes, hey, Gregor Gillespie, let's go. Klose is one of the most exciting new fighters in the game. I'm so excited to see what he does, and he is on my radar as a rising star in the lightweight division. Number 2, Khama Worthy. Khama Worthy was another amazing story from the undercard. Khama Worthy was pulled in last minute, literally knew about this fight less than a week ago, Brick. He replaced Clay Cottard, who was unable to fight, and he faced Devontae Smith. Devontae Smith was 10-1 and a minus 1,000 favorite going into this fight. Khama Worthy was a former training partner of Smith, and they have been really good friends for a long time. Near the end of the first round, Worthy and Smith touched gloves, and Worthy's coach said, do not touch his glove, go after him. Worthy and Smith duked it out in the center of the octagon, and Worthy knocked him out, his former training partner, in the first round for recorded the biggest upset of 2019. It was one of the most incredible things, and Khama Worthy was so excited, and it's beautiful to see these hungry fighters go out and do things and do the impossible and create stars out of themselves. And maybe Khama Worthy becomes a huge star in the UFC. Maybe that was his shining moment, but it will never be the same for Khama Worthy in terms of his experience in the UFC, and I think that's just a beautiful thing.
Here's my shout out that I'd like to give to, although he was a part of possibly Fight of the Year, in my opinion, Yoel Romero, Paulo Costa. Yoel Romero, I think, in my opinion, was overlooked for how unreal his cardio and stamina was. Although his name was up in lights, and although this kind of goes against my description of this round, Yoel Romero's 42 years old. I can't think of an older active fighter, especially in a division like the middleweight division, where you've got guys like Paulo Costa, who is terrifying.
14-year difference.
14-year difference. Yoel Romero was able to take shots, get back up. He was able to wrestle. He literally went all 3 rounds going 100% full gas. He absolutely deserves at least a fight of the night bonus, in my opinion. I don't think, obviously, a title shot is in his reaches for the next maybe 18 months. He's going to have to fight maybe once or twice more to get back into that title contention. But then again, the guy's 42. He's 42 years old. That is unbelievable. And he's fighting guys and taking guys like Paulo Costa the distance in a very questionable decision, might I add.
Very.
So one could argue that Yoel Romero tied or possibly won that bout against an undefeated Paulo Costa at 42 years old.
I think that segues perfectly into round 5, where we want to actually go a little bit more in depth about Yoel Romero and Paulo Costa. And my takeaway, just to start off, these guys have the craziest iron jaws. The shots that both of them took and were giving were unbelievable. I literally was watching the fight, and you guys can go back to the live stream and watch it. I was shocked at the ability to take a shot and give a shot, take a shot and give a shot. And not only that, but how about Yoel Romero mocking Paulo Costa on every big shot? 42 years old, just sticks his tongue out. Haha, can't knock me out, buddy. Sorry, like, I'm too strong. My jaw is too good for you. However, I agreed with the decision, unlike I know a lot of people didn't, and I know that it was a very close call. I think Paulo Costa deserves a title shot. You look at the middleweight division, Kelvin Gastelum is really the only other name that pops out, and he just lost to Israel Adesanya in one of the best fights of the year. However, Paulo Costa deserves the winner of Robert Whittaker and Israel Adesanya. And Paulo Costa's calling him out. Paulo Costa says that he's rooting for Israel Adesanya because he wants to see he wants to see what he can do to Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya, taller, lankier, but much lighter. Paulo Costa, huge, jacked out of his mind guy. It would be very interesting to see. Do I think that Israel Adesanya should start focusing on Paulo Costa? Absolutely not. Robert Whittaker is no joke, and he's going to be making a return, and he is going to be hopefully making an emphatic return, and it'll be a great fight. However, it is very interesting to see what the UFC does with Paulo Costa and what happens after.
Paulo Costa won his fight on Saturday night against Yoel Romero by unanimous decision. The first decision win of Paulo Costa's career. Other than that, he has a submission, and then he has TKOs across the board. He is an absolute atom bomb of a fighter. And I agree with you completely. He will face the winner of Robert Whittaker and Israel Adesanya. There isn't really a debate, I think, that goes into that. Like you just said, he's the only other undefeated middleweight contender other than Israel Adesanya, and that fight is going to be absolutely incredible. Going back to the Yoel Romero-Paulo Costa fight, the reason why that card was so interesting and it had so much hype is because I think these guys are so similar. Not only are they terrifying to look at, they're probably very terrifying to fight. Both of these guys had iron chins and iron fists to go along with it. They were trading. They were wrestling. They looked like two semi-trucks colliding in the first 30 seconds of the fight. You could hear Joe Rogan just losing his mind at what he was actually watching, and I was right there with him. However, the reason why I think Paulo Costa won this fight was because if you looked between rounds, and UFC did a really good job at this, between rounds they would show ultra slow-mo replays of big shots. And although it looked like Paulo Costa was getting rocked multiple times, if you notice, the only real time that Paulo Costa got knocked on his butt was when he lost his footing and Yoel did catch him, but it wasn't anything like he was hurting Paulo Costa. Paulo Costa got beat up, sure, but he has the chin, he had the mental ability to stay in that fight regardless of anything that happened. However, Yoel Romero got clapped a couple of times.
Yeah.
Paulo Costa caught him, dropped him a couple of times, which is why I think, although it was an incredibly close decision and a lot of people didn't agree with it, Paulo Costa, in my opinion, had a more impressive striking performance, a more impressive grappling performance, although the whole thing was fireworks. The entire fight was unbelievable.
To close out the round, I want to do a quick spotlight on the head coach of Paulo Costa, Eric Albarracin, head coach of Henry Cejudo as well. Think about the year he's had, right? A win against TJ Dillashaw, a comeback win against Marlon Moraes, which was unbelievable to give Henry Cejudo double champ status and win the bantamweight championship of the world. And then you have Paulo Costa defeat Yoel Romero, the crazy human specimen that he is versus, just the crazy bodies that they are and the two semi-trucks running at each other. For him to beat that, and now he's the top contender, hopefully, in the middleweight division to take on for the belt. Eric Albarracin is an absolute animal in terms of his coaching and his training ability and all the things that he is doing behind the scenes, behind the curtain of these MMA fighters. And the proof is in the pudding. He's winning fights. He is my pick so far for 2019 UFC Head Coach of the Year.
All right, we are finally there at final thoughts, or as I like to call it, round 6. Jon Jones is the Lance Armstrong of MMA. He's the New England Patriots. He's the Kobe Bryant, the Tiger Woods. Unmatched talent and success, but enough adversity to accrue haters, doubters, and I'm sick of him winning-ers. All around MMA, he's beaten the very best of the best. He has shown us how versatile, strong, smart, and collected of a fighter he truly is. We have been looking for someone to take down Jon Jones because he has enough haters for that to happen. Jon Jones, however, has ended the pure and spotless career of Daniel Cormier. He submitted Rampage Jackson, Vitor Belfort, Lyoto Machida. He's KO'd Chael Sonnen, Shogun Rua, Alexander Gustafsson. The answer is not the heavyweight division, although Stipe would be a great fight. The answer is not the light heavyweight division for Jon Jones because he's already shown how dominant he can be at 205. The answer is not Stipe Miocic. the answer is not Curtis Blades. The answer is not Daniel Cormier. Let's take a look at the fights where Jon Jones has actually struggled, okay? Thiago Santos, his most recent bout. Winner by split decision. Let me remind you, Thiago Santos blew his knee in the first or second round and still gave Jon Jones one of the hardest fights he has had in his entire career. Now, let me compare this to someone we might know. Thiago Santos, Brazilian, terrifying to look at, absolutely massive, a striker, and unbelievably strong. Does that sound like anyone that we know? Let's see, Paulo Costa, Brazilian, unbelievably strong, incredibly talented striker. After Paulo Costa gets his title shot, and if he can stay undefeated, I think the next test for Jon Jones is a fighter like Paulo Costa. What I want to make clear to all MMA fans is that no matter what division you are, if it's 170 or above, all roads lead to Jon Jones. You cannot hold a legendary status in the upper weight classes of the UFC unless you have traveled the path of Jon Jones. The man has 13 successful title defenses. Jon Jones is the pearly gates of the UFC.
Cowboy Cerrone, Justin Gaethje, Tyron Woodley, George Masvidal, Tony Ferguson, Dustin Poirier, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Nate Diaz. All of these fighters have one thing in common. They've all been prospects for the return of Conor McGregor. The name you can't turn down, the money fight, the biggest superstar in the history of the UFC. So why has there been no fight? Well, Cowboy took the fight with Gaethje, and Tyron is waiting for a 170 prospect to get him back to the belt. Tony is waiting for the winner of 242 because obviously he deserves the 155 title fight. Poirier and Khabib have to fight for the belt, and on Saturday, we saw something that shocked a lot of people. Nate Diaz wins after a 3-year layoff, and Joe Rogan asks, who do you want next? The world was thinking, well, it's clear as day. Conor's the biggest name in the game, and the money fight, and the trilogy, and the greatest rivalry in the history of the sport. It's got to be Conor. Diaz calls out Jorge Masvidal. Not to mention the last big prospect that was looking to fight Conor. The MMA community loved it and ate it up. Saturday night, Nate Diaz sent a message. Nate Diaz said, enough with the circus games. I want a fighter. Conor McGregor is the jealous ex-boyfriend, the guy who leaves the girl and breaks her heart, expecting the girl to never get over him. But just like in the world of dating and the world of relationships, the UFC and its fighters are moving on. And guess what? They're doing just fine. These fighters are not waiting. These fighters are chasing belts, training, fighting, living a life of discipline because they know what they want and they are still hungry. What is Conor doing? Smashing phones, punching people in bars, promoting his whiskey, Conor stuff. While he continues to act like he does not care about his fighting career, the rest of his prospects are trying to make something out of theirs. The biggest star, the biggest pull in the game, the best looking fight in the room. But the fighters don't want that. They don't need that. Fighters want to fight. Fighters need to fight. Conor McGregor is the jealous ex-boyfriend of MMA. Really good looking, really fun, really charming. But people are moving forward. Fighters are finding their ways to go on without you. Maybe it's time for Conor to become a fighter once again. Maybe it's time to get back in the game.
Conor McGregor, where are you at? Blake O'Rulian just called out Conor McGregor. Questionably one of the most bold call-outs we've heard in at least a couple of weeks. Remember to tune in on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
We appreciate everybody who's listening. We have t-shirts coming very, very soon, and we are so excited to continue this process with you guys and continue this journey. Thank you so much for listening.
Don't be a Richard. Send us out.